I learned early that airports are built to make departures feel inevitable. The floor shines like certainty, the signs argue with your instincts, and the loudspeaker speaks a language that sounds like it has never been wrong. On the morning I turned 6, I stood in the domestic arrivals hall with a paper cup of strawberry soda sweating in my fist. The ice was melting faster than my patience, and the sugar stuck to my palm like a promise that wouldn't let go. My mother had bought the drink in a blue windbreaker 2 sizes too big, fussing over the zipper as if kindness was something she'd been saving for a special occasion. She smiled the whole time, which should have warned me. My mother only smiled like that when she was about to convince someone, me, a landlord, a teacher, the mirror that her life was under control. She crouched, tapped my nose with one finger, and said, "Stay right here by the baggage carousel. Don't move. I'll be back before the suitcases start coming." Then she walked away so quickly that her heels clicked like punctuation, final and sharp. I watched her weave through strangers toward the doors, and I waited, because children are trained to treat instructions as gravity. At first I counted the circles of the carousel to pass the time. 1 revolution, 2, 3, until the rubber belt began to carry bags that smelled like other lives. Sunscreen, wet fabric, cologne, perfume so sweet it made my eyes water. People rushed in, snagged their luggage, rushed out again, and nobody looked at the boy standing alone with a drink too cold for his small mouth. The loudspeaker announced delays. A janitor pushed a mop and hummed off key. The soda in my cup warmed. I licked the rim and tasted syrup, then tasted something else underneath it. The bitter idea that waiting could be a trap. When I craned my neck toward the doors, I spotted my mother for a heartbeat, her tan coat, her hair tied high, her arm hooked around a little girl's shoulders. A little girl I recognized, not from home but from my mother's stories. The daughter of a man who promised rent help and delivered excuses. My mother moved with the girl toward the parking garage, head angled down as if avoiding cameras. The girl looked back once, and her eyes slid past me like I was invisible. I didn't shout. My throat locked. My legs wouldn't obey. Something inside me tried to explain the scene the way you explain thunder to a scared child. It's just weather. It can't hurt you. It will pass. Then the glass doors hissed shut. And my mother was on the other side of them. That was the moment the world performed a small, impossible trick. Text flickered at the edge of my vision like subtitles nobody else could see. It arrived in fragments, half-sentences, and snide asides, as if an invisible audience had gathered to narrate my humiliation. "Poor kid," the overlay said in one line, as calm as a weather report. "This is the abandonment event. He becomes obsessive afterward." Another line chased it. "Don't pity him too much. In the original timeline, he grows up to shut down the very shelter that saves him." A third voice, sharper, threaded through. "Look left. There's a smaller kid near the vending machines. Wrong adult approaching." The words weren't printed on air. They arrived inside my skull, bright and intrusive, like a radio tuned to the wrong station. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't in my ears. It was in the part of me that had always wished the world came with instructions. I didn't understand what an original timeline was. I barely understood what betrayal meant. But I understood danger when it turned its face toward someone smaller. Near the vending machines, a toddler wobbled on new legs, holding a balloon string too long for his hand. A man in a maintenance jacket angled toward him with false casualness. The overlay shouted numbers. Probability of separation, high. Probability of panic, higher. Probability of harm if intercepted now, catastrophic. My stomach flipped. I set my warm soda on the floor, because the stickiness no longer mattered, and I ran. My feet slapped the polished tiles. Adults turned their heads and then turned them away. The maintenance jacket man stretched out one hand, smiling at the toddler as if offering help. I crashed into his hip like a small battering ram. The man cursed, grabbed my collar, and yanked me off balance. I screamed, not words, just noise, the kind of noise that drags attention out of distracted bodies. A woman with a suitcase swung her bag into the man's shin. Someone else shouted for security. The toddler dropped his balloon and began to cry, lungs full of terror. The man tried to slip into the crowd, but the loudspeaker, for once, worked in my favor. A security guard's voice boomed, crisp and urgent. 2 guards converged, and the maintenance jacket was suddenly just cloth, not authority. The man's smile vanished. He jerked free, but a traveler tripped him with a rolling suitcase on purpose. He hit the floor hard enough to knock air out of him, and a circle formed around him like a fence. I lay on my side with my collar stretched, blinking tears out of my eyes. The overlay, merciless, kept talking. Unexpected intervention. Plot deviation detected. New branch possible. I didn't care about branches. I cared that my mother had walked out of my life as easily as she'd walked toward the parking garage. Police arrived. Then paramedics. Then the toddler's frantic father, who ran as if he could rewrite the last 10 minutes by speed alone. I tried to stand, but my knees shook. A female officer crouched until we were eye level and asked my name. I said it, then said I didn't have a phone number to call. I didn't say my mother was the kind of person who promised cake and bought silence instead. The officer's face softened in a way I hated. Pity feels too close to being owned. Nearby, a man in a charcoal suit and a woman in a white blouse spoke to airport staff with a kind of calm that made people listen. They didn't look rich in a flashy way. They looked like the sort of adults who expected systems to work and didn't panic when they didn't. The woman's hair was clipped back with a simple metal bar. The man's hands were clean, but his knuckles had old scars, like he'd once fixed things and still remembered how. They noticed me when the officer pointed. The woman walked over first, crouched, and offered a tissue without forcing it into my hand. Her voice was warm but not performative. "Are you hurt?" she asked. I shook my head. My throat burned from yelling. The man watched me quietly, eyes sharp, taking in my too big windbreaker, my cheap shoes, the way I kept glancing at the doors as if expecting my mother to reappear and deny everything. He asked, "Did you know that man was going to take the toddler?" I didn't want to tell him about the overlay in my head. I didn't want to be labeled crazy on top of being abandoned, so I said something that was true without explaining why. I saw him reach, and it looked wrong. The man nodded once, like he respected the answer. The overlay whispered, "This is the adoptive father figure candidate. He does not believe in fate, only in evidence." A second whisper, "If he takes you home, your future becomes complicated." A third, almost kind, "Complicated can be good." The officer spoke with the couple, and paperwork began. I learned their names in pieces. The man was Orrin Vale, an engineer who designed emergency systems for public transit. The woman was Maris, a physician who ran a clinic that treated people without insurance by day and fought hospital administrators by night. They had no children, not because they didn't want them, but because life had refused them in quiet, cruel ways. The officer asked if they could keep me under temporary guardianship while social services tried to locate my parent. Maris glanced at Orrin. Orrin glanced at me. I felt my heart swing like a loose door, waiting to be slammed. Then Maris said, "We can take him. If his mother comes back, we will cooperate. If she doesn't, we won't let him vanish into paperwork." Orrin added, flatly, "We have a spare room and enough patients to fill it." That sentence landed in me like a stake driven into soft ground. I didn't know if patience was real, but I knew it sounded better than a shelter. Their home was not a mansion. It was a narrow townhouse near a rail line, with stairs that creaked and shelves full of manuals and novels and board games with missing pieces. The spare room had a desk that looked like it belonged to someone older, and a window that faced a tree whose leaves shook in the wind like nervous hands. Maris gave me pajamas that smelled like laundry soap, not mildew. Orrin showed me where the bathroom was and where the kitchen snacks were, and then left me alone, as if he understood that being watched can feel like another kind of captivity. That night I lay in a bed that did not belong to me and listened to trains glide past outside, each one a reminder that people could leave and still have a destination. The overlay returned, dimmer now, like it had lowered its volume out of respect for new territory. It offered a summary with no sarcasm. Safety achieved. Attachment risk escalating. The next weeks became a test of what adults meant when they said words like stability. Social services made calls. They checked flight records. They asked me if I knew my mother's full name, her birth date, her address. I knew fragments. The way she smelled of citrus when she was anxious. The way she hated being called by her middle name. The way she told me I was too loud in public. None of those were useful to a database. Maris took me to the clinic sometimes, not as a mascot but as a person who needed proof that care could be ordinary. She showed me how to wash my hands properly, and how to ask for what I needed without apologizing. Orrin set up a corner of his workshop for me, a safe space where wires and screws were organized in labeled jars. He taught me that electricity is not magic. It is rules. If you respect rules, the current works with you. If you ignore them, it punishes you without malice. I liked that. Malice had hurt me. Rules felt honest. At school, I didn't tell anyone I'd been abandoned. Children are predators of weakness without knowing they are predators. I told people my mother traveled for work, and I lived with family friends. The overlay, always irritatingly accurate, warned me. Lies used for survival can harden into identity. I ignored it because I was 6, and identity was a word adults used when they wanted to control your answer. I made one friend, a girl named Juno with a crooked tooth and a laugh like breaking ice. She liked puzzles and hated bullies. When a boy shoved me and said I looked like a stray, Juno stepped between us and said, "Strays bite." The boy backed off, uncertain. I decided Juno was a person worth keeping. Oren's work seeped into our life like a second weather pattern. He designed alarms and fail-safes and backup protocols for train stations and bus depots. He took calls at odd hours and kept a go-bag by the door. One night, he brought me along to a transit control room during a minor outage because Maris was on a late shift, and he didn't want to leave me with a neighbor. The room was full of screens showing maps, schedules, and blinking alerts. Oren pointed at a red cluster on a line that cut through the city's poorest district. "If this goes dark," he explained, "people get trapped. Trapped people get hurt. Systems should fail gracefully, not brutally." The overlay chimed in with an obnoxious fact. "In the old timeline, you use these systems to punish people who remind you of your mother." I clenched my jaw. I didn't want an old timeline. I wanted to be a person who did not become a weapon. My mother never came for me. A letter arrived once, months later, with no return address. Inside was a cheap keychain shaped like a heart and a note that read, "You'll be better off without me." No signature. The handwriting was hers, sharp, hurried, trying to look calm. Maris held the note like it was something poisonous. Oren read it once, then locked it in a drawer with the case number. He didn't tell me to forgive her. He didn't tell me to hate her. He said, "Some people choose the easiest exit. That doesn't make their exit your fault." I believed him the way you believe a bridge can hold you, even if you don't understand the math. The overlay offered a rare silence, as if even it didn't know how to narrate an ending that refused to be dramatic. When I turned 10, the overlay changed shape. It stopped arriving as random comments and began arriving as structured prompts, like a checklist. Risk assessment, social conflict at 14. Trigger, rumor about your origin. Countermeasure, document early. Another prompt, observe patterns in adults, not their promises. I hated how useful it was. I hated that my brain had an extra narrator that talked like a cynical consultant. Oren noticed me staring into space sometimes and asked, gently, "What do you hear when you go quiet?" I wanted to tell him everything, but fear sat on my tongue. So I said, "I hear worries." He nodded, as if that was enough. "Everyone hears worries," he said. "The trick is choosing which ones deserve action." Then he taught me how to keep a small notebook of facts. Dates, names, incidents. Evidence, he called it. Evidence is how you keep the world from rewriting you. At 13, I found the first crack in the overlay's confidence. It predicted that a new counselor at school would try to help me by digging into my adoption story in front of peers. It suggested I prepare a rehearsed answer, short and polite. The counselor did try. She asked in a seminar about family structures whether anyone had experienced non-traditional upbringing, eyes settling on me like a spotlight. Before I could speak, Juno raised her hand and said, "That question is invasive, and you can't force a kid to teach your lesson." The room went still. The counselor blushed. I felt something loosen in my chest. The overlay stuttered, as if recalculating. Unexpected ally intervention. Narrative pressure reduced. I realized then that the overlay was not fate. It was probability, and probability can be bullied by people who refuse to cooperate. Maris's clinic faced its own villains, the sort that wore suits and spoke about budgets as if budgets were moral law. An insurance company tried to deny coverage for a patient with a rare infection, betting the patient would give up. Maris didn't give speeches. She collected lab results, timestamps, and phone recordings. She filed an appeal, then filed another, then walked into an administrator's office and said, "I will make your denial public, and your public image will bleed." The company reversed its decision. I watched Maris and learned that confrontation can be clean when you bring proof. Oren, impressed, said, "Your mother fights like an engineer." Maris replied, "Engineers would be better at fighting if they remembered the human cost of their diagrams." Their banter felt like warmth. I stored it like fuel. The first time I saw my biological mother again, I was 16 and riding the train alone after a tutoring session. The platform smelled of wet concrete, and the air was thick with the tired patience of commuters. I saw her across the tracks, older, thinner, hair dyed darker than I remembered. She was arguing with a man, gesturing with a familiar sharpness, and for a heartbeat my body forgot time and returned to the arrivals hall. The overlay flared with warnings. High emotional volatility. Do not approach. Anticipated manipulation attempt. I ignored it. I stepped closer to the edge and called her name. She turned. Her face did a strange dance of recognition and calculation. Then she smiled that same controlled smile. She said, "Look at you. I knew you'd be fine." She said it like she had planned my rescue as a strategy, not as a disappearance. I walked down the stairs and into the station concourse where the sound swallowed secrets. She reached for my arm. I stepped back. She told me she'd done what she had to do, that she'd been trapped, that she'd been trying to protect me from a man she couldn't afford to anger. She insisted that leaving me was the only way to give me a chance. The words were polished, practiced. I realized she had been rehearsing this reunion for years, the way actors rehearse lines they might never deliver. I asked one question. "Why didn't you come back when you could?" Her eyes flickered. She said, "You wouldn't have wanted me." She turned the blame like a coin. I felt anger. Yes, but beneath it was something steadier. Clarity. I said, "I wanted a mother, not an excuse." The sentence surprised even me. The overlay, quiet for once, offered a simple note. Boundary established. Outcome favorable. She tried another tactic. She said she was sick. She said she needed money. She said she'd heard Oren had a good job, and Maris had a clinic, and that they could spare some help. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't get to abandon someone and then invoice their safety," I said. A woman nearby glanced over, sensing a scene. My mother leaned closer and hissed that I was ungrateful. She said I was cold. She said Oren and Maris had turned me against her. I answered, calmly, "No. You did that when you walked away and didn't look back." Then I pulled out my phone, opened a note labeled evidence, and showed her the photo of the keychain and the note she'd sent when I was 6. Her face drained. People hate being reminded that records exist. She stepped away as if the paper might burn her. She muttered something about fate and walked off into the crowd, swallowed by strangers again. I went home shaking. Maris didn't say, "I told you so." She made tea and let silence do the work until my breathing slowed. Oren asked what my mother had wanted. I told him. Oren's jaw tightened, and he said, "She wanted to treat your life like a vending machine, put in guilt, get out cash." Then he did something he rarely did. He hugged me, firm and awkward, like a person who had learned affection in adulthood. Maris tucked a blanket around my shoulders, even though I wasn't cold. The overlay, perhaps embarrassed by how ordinary care could be, shifted back into faint background noise. When college applications arrived, I aimed for programs that dealt with public safety and resilient infrastructure. Oren tried not to influence me, but his eyes lit up when I mentioned emergency systems. Maris offered a different angle. Choose somewhere that teaches ethics as hard as equations. I applied to a state university with a renowned transit lab and a scholarship fund for foster and adopted kids. The admissions essay asked for adversity, the kind of prompt that turns pain into a commodity. I wrote about the arrivals hall, yes, but I wrote more about the toddler by the vending machines, about how one child's scream can recruit strangers into decency, and how systems should make decency easier. I wrote about evidence, about documentation, about the difference between being rescued and being designed for. I wrote, bluntly, that I refused to become the villain my own fear predicted. I got in. The acceptance email arrived at 2:17 a.m. because universities apparently enjoy dramatic timing. I sat in the kitchen with my laptop open, staring at the word congratulations until it stopped looking like a word. Maris woke, padded and barefoot, and read over my shoulder. She pressed her forehead against mine for a second and whispered, "You did it." Oren arrived next, hair messy, and demanded to see the letter like he didn't trust the internet. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Good. Now we build the next thing." That was Oren's version of celebration. I liked it. It meant the future was not just something that happened. It was something you assembled. At university, I met people who had never worried about rent. They talked about internships at private firms like those firms were personal friends. I felt the old itch of suspicion if life had abandoned me once. It could do it again. The overlay tried to predict my isolation and offered a defensive script. Keep relationships transactional. I resisted. I joined a student group that mapped wheelchair access in neglected stations. I volunteered in a community tech lab that refurbished old devices for low-income families. I took a part-time job repairing sensors in the transit lab because touching tools calmed my brain. I learned that belonging is not a gift you wait for. It's a set of actions you repeat until your presence becomes normal. During my sophomore year, a city council member pitched a smart surveillance plan for stations, promising safety by watching everyone more. The plan looked sleek in slides and rotten in details. It would monitor faces, flag suspicious behavior, and send alerts to police. The neighborhoods that would be flagged most often were the ones already over-policed. Oren warned me about shiny solutions that hide violence. Maris warned me about systems that confuse control with care. The overlay, unexpectedly, agreed. In old timeline, this program fuels your bitterness. In new timeline, you can dismantle it. I decided I hated being told what my old timeline did, but I liked the idea of dismantling. I built an alternative proposal with my lab team. Better lighting, clear sightlines, staffed help desks, and anonymous emergency buttons that connected to trained social responders, not just armed officers. We backed it with data from similar programs. We presented it at a public hearing. The council member smiled politely and tried to dismiss us as idealists. Then a grandmother stood up and said she'd rather be helped than watched. The room applauded. The vote postponed. Change, I learned, is often a delay you force until better options have time to exist. The overlay became less of a heckler and more like a tool I could negotiate with. When it threw out a prediction, I asked myself whether the prediction was a warning or a trap. Sometimes it was useful. It flagged a professor who offered me a special opportunity that turned out to be unpaid labor wrapped in flattery. It warned me that a student leader was collecting volunteers' personal data for ego points. It reminded me to lock my bike, but sometimes it was cruel, insisting that people would leave eventually, so I shouldn't invest. Those were the moments I chose to disobey it on purpose, as if disobedience itself was a muscle that needed exercise. In my senior year, a severe storm hit the region, the kind that turns streets into rivers and turns power grids into rumors. The city's transit control center flooded when a basement pump failed. Trains stopped. Elevators died. People got trapped on platforms with no announcements and no light. Oren was called in as a consultant. Maris's clinic filled with people who needed medication and warmth and a place to charge a phone. I came home for the emergency period and worked alongside them, because I could not watch from a distance. The overlay, tense, streamed risk notes like a frantic dispatcher. I ignored the numbers and focused on tasks. Distribute headlamps, set up temporary charging stations, map which stations were accessible, coordinate rides for people with disabilities. Juno, now studying law, arrived with a folder of emergency regulations and started pressuring officials to open community centers as shelters. A young mechanic named Noor led a crew to restore power to a stranded train by cannibalizing spare parts. The city's failure became, in our hands, a lesson in what competence looks like under pressure. After the storm, the mayor wanted to call the response heroic. Oren refused the word. Heroic makes negligence feel romantic, he said. Maris published a report listing every failure point, every ignored maintenance request, every budget cut that had turned inconvenience into danger. The report was dry, not dramatic, and that dryness was its blade. I added a technical appendix with timestamps from system logs and a proposed schedule for upgrades with community oversight. When reporters asked me for a personal angle, I told them the truth without offering my wounds as entertainment. I grew up learning that safety is not a feeling, it's an infrastructure. If you don't build it, you pay for it in panic. The article that followed didn't call me inspiring. It called our recommendations specific. I preferred that. On the day I graduated, I walked across the stage and searched the crowd until I found Oren and Maris. Oren wore a suit that fit like it annoyed him. Maris waved a small flag that said congrats in glittery letters because she enjoyed embarrassing him. Juno shouted my name loud enough to startle the dignified families around her. I laughed, real laughter, and the overlay went silent for an entire minute, as if it had lost interest in narrating a life that refused its usual tragedy. After the ceremony, Oren handed me a small metal object he'd machined himself, a hexagonal key with grooves cut precisely. It wasn't for any actual lock. It was symbolic, but Oren hated symbols unless they were useful. He said, This is your reminder. Systems have access points. Find them. Maris hugged me and whispered, and remember that access without compassion is just another door you slam on someone. My first job was with a public interest engineering group that partnered with cities on resilient transit. The pay was decent, the work unglamorous, the politics exhausting. I loved it. I wrote code that monitored pumps and flagged maintenance needs before failure. I designed alert systems that communicated plainly in multiple languages. I insisted on public dashboards that showed delays in repairs, because secrecy breeds neglect. Some officials resisted. They said transparency would cause outrage. I told them outrage was better than drowning in a station stairwell. When an executive tried to cut the community oversight meetings, I showed him the storm report, the lawsuit risk, and the cost-benefit analysis. He sighed and agreed, not because he grew a conscience, but because evidence is a lever that moves even selfish people. The year after the storm report, our group launched a pilot called Plain Signal. It was a small package, cheap enough to be replaced and sturdy enough to survive sabotage. A battery-backed beacon, a speaker, and a simple button that did not ask for your name before it offered help. We installed them in 3 stations that had the highest rate of late-night incidents. The beacons played calm instructions during outages, and when pressed, they connected callers to a staffed line trained to triage needs. Medical, safety, shelter, translation, or just a calm voice. The first week, most calls were pranks. The second week, a woman used one to report that a man was following her and that the station booth was empty. The responder stayed on the line until a transit worker arrived, and the woman got home without having to justify why fear counts as an emergency. A month later, an elderly man used the button because he'd lost his hearing aid and could not understand the platform announcements. The responder guided him to a staff member who helped him find the device and a quiet corner to sit. None of these moments made the news, which meant the beacons were doing their job. A vendor who profited from surveillance contracts tried to smear the pilot as naive. They paid a blogger to claim the buttons were a backdoor for crime. Oren read the post, smiled without humor, and asked me to pull the access logs. We published anonymized call statistics and response times, plus an independent audit of the system's security. Maris wrote the public-facing explanation in plain language, with no jargon to hide behind. The smear campaign died in daylight. That was another lesson. Misinformation rots in the dark, and transparency is a kind of disinfectant. The overlay tried to take credit for our strategy, flashing a smug note about optimal countermeasures. I told it to shut up in my head and laughed when it offered no rebuttal. Late one autumn, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read only, "I saw you at the airport." The message was brief and careful. A woman said she'd been in the arrivals hall years ago, watching the maintenance jacket man hover near the toddler. She wrote that she'd frozen, too afraid to intervene, and that she'd never forgiven herself. She had seen me act, heard my scream, and carried the memory like a debt. Now, after reading about Plain Signal, she wanted to volunteer for the responder line. I forwarded the email to Maris and said, "We should let her." Maris replied, "Guilt can be a doorway, if you turn it toward repair." The woman completed training and became one of our most consistent responders. She didn't seek praise. She sought work. Watching her, I felt the strange, slow relief of seeing fear transformed into something useful. There was, however, one more test I didn't anticipate. Success attracts people who want to reframe it as theirs. When Plain Signal gained traction, a private contractor approached our group with a proposal to scale the solution nationally. Their budget was enormous, their timeline aggressive, their language glossy. They wanted to replace our staffed responder line with an automated voice assistant, and to require users to submit a face scan before receiving directions. To prevent misuse, the executive speaking to us was polite in the way of someone who has never been told no. He praised our idealism, then offered to buy it. The overlay flashed a warning. In old timeline, you accept. In new timeline, you refuse, and they retaliate. I felt the old fear of losing resources, fear of being outspent, fear that saying no would invite punishment. Oren would have called that fear a system flaw. Maris would have called it a symptom. I called it a memory. Then I looked at the executive and asked a simple question. How many nights have you stood on a platform with no lights, listening to the dark? He smiled again, thinner this time, and said that lived experience was valuable, but that data-driven solutions were more consistent. I answered that consistency without dignity is simply efficient cruelty. The meeting ended with a handshake that felt like a threat. Retaliation arrived as paperwork. The contractor filed patent challenges, claiming our beacon design infringed on their older, unused patents. They lobbied city officials, whispering that our group was reckless, and that if anything went wrong, the officials would be blamed for choosing amateurs over professionals. They offered dinners, golf outings, and future job promises. The city's procurement office started delaying our renewals. The responder line, which depended on predictable funding, became fragile. The overlay suggested a dozen tactical moves, but none of them mattered as much as one truth. We were being pressured into giving up. I called Oren. He was retired, but retirement for him was just a change in battlefield. He listened, asked for the names of the decision-makers, and said, calmly, "Let's map the circuit." Maris, hearing my end of the call, already had her laptop open. She loved a fight that could be won with documents. We built a counter-campaign the way you build a bridge. Anchor points first. Juno drafted public record requests and obtained email threads showing procurement officers receiving gifts. Noor gathered testimony from station workers whose maintenance requests had been ignored by the contractor for years. Maris reached out to patient advocates who understood the language of harm. I compiled performance data from the pilot stations, including incident reductions and response times. We held a community meeting in a library, not a fancy hall, and invited the press. The executive didn't attend, but his representatives did, sitting in the back with smiles that tried to look neutral. A teenager stood up and said he'd used the beacon when his little sister had an asthma attack on a platform during an outage. An elderly woman said she'd pressed the button when she got lost, and that the responder had spoken to her in her own language, slow and patient. A night shift cleaner said the beacons made him feel less alone. None of those testimonies were dramatic, and that was the point. The contractor's efficient plan could not compete with the messy power of people describing what it means to be treated as human. The next day, the mayor's office called, suddenly eager to appear supportive. The procurement delay lifted. The patent challenge didn't disappear, but it weakened under scrutiny once we showed that our design choices were independently developed and publicly documented. The contractor backed off, not because they became ethical, but because scandal is expensive. When the dust settled, I sat at Oren's kitchen table again, older hands on the same wood, and realized that this was another kind of adoption. The city learning to accept care that wasn't for sale. Oren poured tea like it was a ceremonial act and said, "This is why you keep evidence." Maris, on speaker, added, "And this is why you build communities, not products." The overlay offered a small, begrudging note. Outcome improved by collective action. It sounded almost like approval. Not long after, I received another message from my biological mother. This one came through a mutual acquaintance who claimed she was in real trouble. The acquaintance said my mother was living in a rented room, sick and frightened. The acquaintance said she regretted everything. The overlay immediately pushed a recommendation. Do not engage. High manipulation risk. My body reacted anyway, old loyalty, old hunger, old grief. I drove to the address with Juno's number ready, Maris's advice in my ear, and Oren's evidence notebook in my pocket. The room smelled of cheap detergent and damp walls. My mother lay on a narrow bed, eyes hollow, hair grayer than I expected. She looked smaller than the monster in my memories, which is one of life's cruel jokes. Reality shrinks what fear inflates. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if her practiced speeches had finally run out. I waited. After a long silence, she said, "I heard you're doing good things." The sentence was clumsy, not polished. Then she said, "I didn't know how to stay." She didn't ask for money immediately. She didn't blame me immediately. She just stared at the ceiling and whispered, "I kept thinking you'd forget me, and then it would hurt less." The confession didn't absolve her. It didn't even soften the facts. But it changed something in me. It clarified that her abandonment had never been about my worth. It had been about her weakness. I asked if she had a doctor. She said no. I told her I wouldn't become her caretaker, and I meant it. But I also didn't leave her without a path. I called Maris's clinic and arranged an appointment with a social worker. I paid for her antibiotics. I left a printed list of shelters and hotlines. Then I said, quietly, "I hope you choose to live, but you don't get to choose my life anymore." She cried, and for once the tears didn't feel like a tactic. They felt like consequence. Driving home, I expected to feel either triumph or collapse. Instead, I felt something like maintenance again. A small repair made without pretending the building was new. I told Oren and Maris what happened. Maris said she was proud of me for helping without surrendering. Oren said he was proud of me for walking out the door on my own terms. The overlay remained silent, as if it couldn't find a snide angle that fit. That night I slept with fewer nightmares, not because I forgave, but because I stopped negotiating with the past. A year later, our group transitioned from a project to an institution. We created a foundation with a board that included station workers, disability advocates, and community members, not only engineers and donors. We wrote bylaws that required transparency, audits, and open meetings. It was slower. It was harder. It was harder on purpose. During the first board meeting, a donor tried to demand naming rights in exchange for funds. I said no. I watched the donor frown, then reconsider, surprised by resistance. I remembered the boy at the carousel, frozen and obedient, and I felt a pulse of gratitude for every person who had taught me to move. The overlay, in the faintest whisper, offered a closing suggestion. Continue choosing. I smiled, because the suggestion finally sounded less like prophecy and more like permission. On my 25th birthday, I found myself back in the same arrivals hall, not as a stranded child but as an adult waiting for Maris to return from a medical conference. I stood near the carousel with a paper cup of strawberry soda, bought on purpose as a dare to my own memory. The loudspeaker called flights. People rushed. The floor still shone. I watched a little boy in a too big windbreaker holding his mother's hand too tightly. The mother checked her phone, distracted, and the boy's face tightened with fear. I leaned down and said, softly, "If you get separated, don't freeze. Make noise. Ask for help." The mother looked up, startled, then grateful. The boy nodded solemnly. His hand loosened, just a little. Maris appeared through the doors with a carry-on and a tired smile. Oren followed, because he had decided to come too, pretending it was for logistical reasons. I walked toward them, soda in hand, and felt the past hover like a ghost that had finally learned to sit quietly. The overlay offered one last line, almost tender. Loop closed. Outcome. Chosen family maintained. Then it faded into the background like an app you don't uninstall because, annoyingly, it sometimes saves you. I hugged Maris. I shook Oren's hand, then pulled him into a hug too, because I had learned that affection can be built like anything else, by insisting on it until it becomes normal. We left the airport together. Outside, the wind smelled of rain and fuel and possibility. I didn't know what the next timeline would hold, and for once that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than threat. One more thing I learned is that hope is not a mood. It is a practice with receipts. It looks like checklists taped beside breaker boxes, like phone numbers written on wrists in marker at crowded events, like a neighbor knocking to ask if you got home safely. It looks like a child being believed on the first try. It looks like a city admitting its own weak points out loud. And it looks like a boy who once froze on polished tiles choosing, again and again, to move. In the years that followed, I stopped thinking of the overlay as a curse and started treating it like a rough draft. A rough draft is not a verdict. It is something you revise. I revised it with people, with policy, with stubborn kindness. Whenever the overlay predicted that a stranger would ignore someone in trouble, I practiced being the stranger who didn't. Whenever it predicted that power would choose secrecy, I practiced dragging information into daylight. Whenever it predicted that I would harden into a small, private tyrant, I practiced asking for help before fear made decisions for me. If fate existed, it was not the first version of the story. It was the version you kept rewriting until it fit the world you wanted to live in. I keep a private ritual now. Whenever I enter a station, I locate 3 things. Before anything else, the nearest help point, the clearest exit, and a person who looks lost. The first 2 are for me. The third is for the world. If I can offer directions without suspicion, then I'm not living inside my old fear. Sometimes the person waves me off. Sometimes they accept. And once in a while they smile with relief so visible it changes the air. Those small exchanges don't erase the